Welcome to the Beth Yeshua Podcast. For more episodes like this, visit bethyeshua.org/media. Hi everybody, welcome back to the Beth Yeshua Messianic Congregation Podcast. I am your host, Josh Rubinstein. I'm here with my co-host, Shari Rubinstein. Hi, Mom.
Hey, Josh. Great to be here.
Yeah, I agree. We've been off for a couple of weeks. It's been a mix and match of like all sorts of things. And we actually might even be off some weeks in the future. There's some travels and other things that are coming up. But we're glad to be back with you guys. Just as a reminder, you can watch instead of just hear our voices if you go over to YouTube or Spotify. And you can find the Beth Yeshua podcast wherever you download or listen to your podcasts. So today we have a special one. I don't know. Do I say everyone is special? Probably. I think of them all as special. But this one is a special one. We're going to be in part 3 of our conversation of who is a Jew and who gets to decide. And so we've already had 2 parts of this. You might want to go back and listen to those first if you haven't heard those before you come into this conversation, because it'll make a lot more sense. We're going to begin, as we often do, with Messianic superpowers, and then we're going to go into the conversation. Today we're going to be specifically focused on intermarriage and the issues kind of surrounding intermarriage and identity, especially like Jewish and Gentile identity within families and transmitting values onto the next generation. And then we'll conclude today with a kosher or treif. And actually today, Bubby has chosen one that is literally kosher or treif. So that should be a good one. I'm excited about that. All right, so, Bubby, if you could have a Messianic superpower, what would it be?
Well, today I was reading a story to your daughter, to Ava, and it was about Sleeping Beauty, and it was about the queen who wanted to be the fairest of them all, and she looked in the mirror and remembered what was told to her. And it made me think about, if I had a superpower, I wish I did have a magic mirror, but it would be different. I wish I could have people look at a magic mirror and see the way God really feels about them. I think most of us get the idea that we're always disappointing God, and it's not true. Yeah. He understands how hard it is for everything that's going on on earth. He understands the trials and tribulations. He's been here. He gets it. And so I just wish I could show people the way God sees them. And maybe that we as believers can do that for them. We can be that mirror, that when they see the reflection on our face of the love that we have for them, they will see that that is the Father's love.
That reminds me, I was listening to a pretty famous teacher recently, Bible teacher, and they were talking about they were raised by a very hard father, a very kind of unloving, critical, harsh father. And that affected the way that they saw God. They saw God as harsh and unloving and unforgiving. And it really colored the way that they valued themselves, but also the way that they felt that God looked at them often. I wonder how much of that is colored by our earthly fathers, how much of that is our own baggage, and how much of it is just warfare, just a spiritual warfare against us to keep us from knowing that we're valuable and loved.
Well, and we talked about this earlier about just the fact that fathers on this earth have it so tough. Sure. To be able to be in that role and to be accepted and to be appreciated and respected in that role. And so, of course, I think that's the front line. That's where the enemy wants to attack. Yeah. To attack fathers on this earth so that maybe fathers aren't as kind and loving to their kids. And that we do tend to think that that's the way the Heavenly Father is.
Sure. But, I mean, lest we forget, I think all of the family is under attack, as we would
Absolutely.
say. There's a spiritual war in this world, and moms and children and everybody else,
That's right.
cousins and grandbabies and grandmas and grandpas, everybody's under attack. So that's a good one. I like that. If I was to have a Messianic superpower, I was actually just thinking about the fact that this upcoming Shabbat, we have a special guest from Israel. And I think about how powerful that is for grounding our community in the bigger picture of Messianic Judaism. There's a prophetic reality of Messianic Judaism, which is Jewish people in the land of Israel loving Messiah, welcoming him back, saying Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. I wish I had the superpower of having every single Messianic congregation around the world have a deep connection, or like a person that they were connected to who lived in the land of Israel, that was a strong believer, maybe not even necessarily involved in ministry, but to just understand and be connected to the land. It's so interesting to me. We deal with so many things here in the United States that are not even issues in Israel. Like you talk about identity confusion, for example, and there's not identity confusion in Israel. Like a Jew is a Jew, a Gentile is a Gentile. Like it's not like there's none of this weird like wanting to be one another or trying to be one another. It kind of doesn't exist because they're in the land. They're in the land that was given to the Jewish people. There's no debate about, who the land should belong to there, at least certainly within the believing community in Israel, unfortunately.
And among the Jewish ones.
Well, there are some Jews even.
That's
though,
true.
Right?
That's exactly true, of
who,
course.
because of whatever, believe that the Jewish people should not be in the land of Israel. And it's interesting, even among the Haredi, even among the Orthodox, there are Jews that don't believe that really Israel is the actual manifestation of the nation of the Jewish people, because that nation should only exist under Messiah.
Exactly. Right.
Which, I get there's a future coming reality of that kingdom. I don't think that also, though, negates what's actually happening in Israel. So that was the battle.
That was the Zionists. The whole thing was, that the Jews who were opposing Zionism, it was more about that. It was more about God's going to bring it about in his time when he brings Messiah, and we're not to make it happen. And it was more of a man trying to make something happen.
Right. And can anything good come out of the United Nations? I don't know. Honestly, like maybe the formation of the state of Israel, and that's about it that I've seen. Anyways, so let's jump right into our talk. For those who haven't seen the other two podcasts, this is our third, and we dealt really at the beginning with a little bit of telling of our own stories, and then also talking about the different branches within Judaism and how Judaism sees Jewish identity based on which branch people are part of. I'm thinking about it now, though. We never really had a conversation about secular Jewish people.
That's true.
And about how they have their own like cultural affectations and cultural realities that are passed down from generation to generation, right? Like you may not necessarily fast from leaven all throughout the Passover festival, and yet you might celebrate a Seder on the first night with your family culturally, right, as a secular Jew, because that's important. It's the ties that bind together families. Anyways, we did talk about that, and then in the second, we really got into more of like, okay, what is the UMJC, which is the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. Beth Yeshua is part of the UMJC. What do they say about their halakha for who's a Jew? What does Israel say about who is a Jew? And what do we say? What does Beth Yeshua Messianic Congregation say about who we consider to be Jewish and why? And to really encapsulate all of that, we really kind of adhere to a patrilineal as well as matrilineal descent, which is really more of like Reform Judaism, kind of that standard that they're at. And we also sort of like them are tied to, has the person been raised in Jewish practice? Have they been meaningfully participating in Jewish life? So that's kind of like where we're at. UMJC is very similar. Israel, of course, has different standards. They have a standard for just returning as a citizen, like of Jewish descent, and then they have people that are halakhically Jewish, which is born to a Jewish mother, and those are kind of different classifications of Jewish identity. And then there are like Israelis who don't consider themselves Jewish because they're not religious, and so they don't think of themselves as Jews per se, that's a whole different conversation. We could get into that, but so this time we're gonna talk about. There's a growing reality of intermarriage, although, Bubby, I know you've researched a lot of the statistics, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but there is a growing amount of intermarriage within Jewish life, just in the United States and abroad. And as people are intermarried, there's all sorts of potential issues within the marriage itself of like, what will we celebrate? What will we observe? How are we going to live? But then a lot of that really comes to a head when you deal with how are we going to raise our children? What are
Yes,
our
absolutely.
kids going to be? And so we actually were really privileged to be invited to an intermarried celebration of a Brit Milah, of a bris. This was a few weeks ago, and it was really wonderful. And without giving names or anything like that, I thought it was a really delightful way to celebrate it. And I was just kind of wondering, Bubby, what were your thoughts as you went to this intermarriage celebration of the bris?
Well, I thought it was interesting, first of all, that it was being held, 2 months later
Mm-hmm.
after the bris. And in
And the
this
bris
case,
originally had been performed by a doctor, not
by
by
a
a moil.
doctor.
Right.
Right, not a mole. But I believe it was still on the eighth day. I didn't determine that. Did they explain that
I'm
to you?
pretty sure.
They did it on the eighth day.
Yeah.
But I thought I think this being an intermarried family, and in this case the woman is the Jewish one and the man is not. I think it's kind of points out the difficulties in especially in intermarried families where the man is not the one that's Jewish, because he's establishing the spiritual home basically, and with this big thrust for some kind of a major ceremony around his son. I thought it was just really wonderful that he was willing to do this, that he saw the importance of this, and they invited in people that had been important in their lives.
Yep.
And in the lives and had supported the two pregnancies, because they have a daughter also. And I thought it was also interesting, they had never done a naming ceremony for the daughter.
Right.
And they did that at this same time.
Right.
And that was, I thought it was extremely special. They had just a couple of kids there that were friends with her, because the baby, of course, is only 2 months old. But I just thought it was extremely sweet. Such a sweet time.
Yeah.
I just really felt the presence of God there. I felt like it was really blessing God's heart.
And they invited a pastor. They're attending a church there where they live, and they invited that local pastor to come and also to pray a blessing. And so we kind of had a different ceremony than you might normally have, with a kavader coming around to people with the baby and inviting them to say a blessing. Since it wasn't just the traditional blessings by the moil and maybe by the family. And so it was really neat to have this pastor pray over the baby. And I even got to have a conversation with him later. And he, interestingly enough, had visited Israel, I think in the 1980s, and had a visit with the Messianic community, the Messianic Jewish community back in the 1980s in Israel, when they were under such persecution. If you remember, there was even fire bombings of Messianic synagogues, burning of the entire buildings and other things like that. So this Messianic synagogue that he was going to visit wouldn't even tell him where they met. And so he had to just show up at this random place, and then they showed him where the actual place was. And they were meeting outdoors. They were meeting in a forest, because their building had been destroyed. And so he actually really had a heart for Israel, and he had a heart for Jewish people, and it was really kind of amazing to see that sweetness. I don't think that he fully understood maybe the importance. He did at one point refer to this cultural celebration, I think is what he called it.
Okay.
Right? And to me, that right there is the distinction between what we are understanding as Messianic Jews and what the rest of the body of Messiah sees us as sometimes.
Yes.
I think they sometimes just see us as a culture, just like any other culture, Mexican or Italian or British or Scottish or whatever, and that when we come to Messiah, it's okay for us to continue to celebrate our culture if it doesn't conflict with, the Word of God or specific commandments, right? What they don't see is that that's commanded. The Brit Milah is actually a commandment to the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob throughout their generations. And it's a command that God has never abrogated and he's never gotten rid of. And the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable. And if you had deep theological conversation with a pastor, maybe they would get to it. Maybe they would understand it. But they might also not, because it's almost like there has to be, in the same way I think that you need the Ruach, you need the Spirit to awaken a Jewish person to Messiah. and help them to really, like, the Spirit needs to open their eyes so that they can see who Messiah is.
Yes.
I feel the same way about the body of Messiah, understanding that God's not done with the Jewish people, that there's still a very distinct role for the Jewish people, and it's almost like the Spirit has to open their eyes. And that wasn't where that pastor was. He was sweet, he was kind, he was honoring the culture, but he wasn't understanding, no, this family was obeying the commandments of God.
Commandment.
Right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that actually even kind of goes to the heart of the challenges for an intermarried family. Because if you talk to younger intermarried couples, I've had the privilege of doing marriage counseling with some intermarried couples before their marriage. They often see Jewish identity as just one of the ethnicities, one of the cultures that they're going to potentially pass on to their children. They don't necessarily view it through the lens of, well, one of us is a Jew, therefore these children are Jews, therefore they might be participating or called to participate in the calling of the Jewish people, which is distinct from the nations. Now, mostly it overlaps, but there are some things that are distinct that those Jewish children and the Jewish people within those marriages should have to wrestle with. And it is hard. It's hard to say, especially in this egalitarian world, that we should pay special attention to one ethnicity within the intermarriage, right? I mean, wouldn't you agree that as you've had conversations with some of these younger couples, especially the younger generations, they have a hard time wrestling through the primacy of Jewish identity?
It kind of gets back to that whole thing of the chosenness issue, but also it feels like prejudice to them. It feels like
bias.
I mean, it is a bias,
and it is
a bias, but it's not a prejudice in the sense that we're doing any prejudging. God established this, and I know we've talked a bit about how many various ethnicities you have in you that came from me and came from your dad, and
right.
and it's a wealth of some major cultures, and even some other oppressed peoples.
Right.
So it's really difficult, especially I think when we are dealing with other oppressed peoples, that any group that have come under scrutiny to the point of threatened annihilation, certainly share a bond with the Jewish people, but it's not the same. It's still not the same. It's still God saying, as you put it, it's a calling. It's not just yes, you're Jewish. Yes, you're Irish. Yes, you're Welsh. To go through this list, it's a specific calling with that one, and it does not have to diminish any of the other aspects of who we are. I think that's the thing that we have to deal with, and to put things in perspective. It doesn't change the value of every culture that God made, but He made a specific purpose for the Jewish people that it will not be fulfilled until the end.
Right.
And so somehow we've got to acknowledge that in our homes, and so that our children come out with that identity.
Right. I was struck as you were talking of the idea of an end-sum game, where we believe that there's only 100% of value. And so if the Jewish value within the ethnic makeup of the children is going to receive more attention and be focused on maybe more, at least maybe at the beginning as it's being really investigated and they're figuring out their halakha within their home, then it's almost as if people believe that it diminishes the others, right? It was kind of like our conversation about men and women, that people see it as a diminishing of women, that they can't do the things that men can do. And some see it as a diminishing of men, that they can't do the things that women can do. And it is hard, I guess, for us as people to wrap our head around the fact that specialization and uniqueness is actually a beautiful thing, and it doesn't diminish, right? It doesn't diminish my value, especially when we celebrate things. And it's hard, I think about a person on the sidelines watching a football game and watching a star player and seeing that star player at the height of their game and being amazing and thinking oh man, that person
Yeah.
is so much more valuable than
Hmm.
I am, right? And it's interesting in this day and age, we also do this when we're comparing ourselves with people on social media. This is one of the maybe the social diseases of our time is young people comparing themselves with other people's public profiles online on
Oh
Instagram,
my.
on
Oh my.
TikTok and everything else, where
Yeah.
people present the very best, the most polished version of themselves.
Hmm.
And people outside of that say, ooh, well, my life doesn't line up with that. So I must not be as valuable as you. I must not be as cool as you.
Hmm.
Like, I need to be more like you. And there's this diminishing of self worth, which honestly, I feel like can only come from our enemy. There's no way that
That's right.
we are not like being hoodwinked into this false comparison of value, in which my value is diminished because the star football player's value is increasing at the moment. And
Hmm.
also, we have to remember too that, like, all these people that are showing us the most polished parts of their life, they probably have parts of their life that are a mess,
Absolutely. They have
right?
to. We all do.
Right. And so when we're comparing ourselves to this fake version of them, we see like, oh, they have it all together. Why don't I?
Yeah,
And it's the same, I think, with identity. It's like,
it
well,
is.
if we're going to celebrate Jewishness and put it up here, like, what about this other heritage of the Gentile person in the marriage that means so much to them, and the culture that's been passed down by their family, and the foods that they eat, and the days that
Hmm.
they celebrate, and honestly, my answer to that is do it all. Unless
Hmm.
like any of
Hmm.
those celebrations conflict with the Word of God, do it
Yes.
all. The fact that the kids have to wrestle through a bit of like a calling
Yeah,
from God doesn't in any way diminish the celebration of the other cultures and the value of those.
that's right. Yeah, that's definitely right. Yeah. Well, I think one thing that we have been seeing is that Jews who are by religion. I mean, even if we're just calling them Jews by religion, whether you know, I'm assuming that that means they're ethnically Jews, but we are seeing that people identifying themselves, self-identifying with the Pew Research, they tend to go with self-identifying. And if
Right.
somebody self-identifies as a Jewish person, then they're seeing that Jewish people in America, especially, are dwindling
Mm.
significantly. Would you like to hear some statistics on the different generations
Yeah, please.
about that? Is this a good place for that, or
Yeah,
would
that's a
that?
great place for
Okay,
it.
okay. So, in the generation that they're calling the greatest generation, which is 1914 to 1927, 93% of the Jews in America basically are identifying as being Jews by religion, and 7% saying they have no religion. The silent generation, which I'm part of, which I find kind of ridiculously funny, but it goes up to 1945, and it had gone down to 86%, and then
So this
down,
is you're
yeah,
talking about a diminishing of religious
identification,
identification.
identifying themselves as Jewish, as being Jewish, in terms of religion.
Right.
Okay, okay,
So the interesting thing to me is that there are 14%, because that was 86%, right?
right.
So
So
there are
14%,
14% of people who consider
none,
themselves
right,
Jewish, but don't identify as religiously
as
Jewish.
religious Jews. Right,
Right.
right,
Okay. So to
and
me,
it
this
keeps
is more of
going
a
down. Yeah.
devaluing of religious observance rather than Jewish identity in some ways. But anyways,
Well,
keep going.
maybe you're right, but I mean, Jewish observance is a part of it, and of course
Sure.
and by definition, they're probably saying they have at least one Jewish parent
Right.
to define themselves, and I'm supposing that they're not. It could be that this is only dealing with matrilineal, but I didn't see that on the research, because if someone's self-identifying as a Jew, are they going by the Orthodox standard, and saying, well, your mother has to be Jewish and it can't be your father also? So that's another
Mm.
thing about the statistics that, I'm concerned about the fact that they're dropping, if these are only ones that are coming from Jewish mothers, which I think they might be, because it keeps going down. The boomers, it's 81%, and Gen X is 74%, and the millennials is 68%.
Mm.
So, but see, don't you think I think it's dealing with self-identifying Jewish people, but they're keeping that standard that we kind of keep bucking up against, that it's only the mother that provides that lineage. So at any rate, so I think it's a little hard to draw too many conclusions, from that.
Right.
But
Right.
anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting thing.
The diminishing of identification with being religious as a Jew makes sense.
Yes.
Because we have the same diminishing within basically all organized religion.
That's
all
true.
All organized
Yes.
religion really, since the early 1900s, has been decreasing in numbers of people who self-identify with organized religion.
Yes.
And you have a lot of people who still consider themselves, quote, spiritual, but they don't necessarily identify themselves. Now, one way I could see this tied specifically to marriage is that being an observant religious Jew, typically it is stressed to you that you should marry another Jewish person.
Exactly.
And you should raise Jewish children. And so that pressure has been diminishing also. But then the other place I could see it is that observance within, especially like a synagogue and a community, would help transmit Jewish value on from generation to generation, because your children would be seeing the example of the greater community and how to live as a Jew and what it means to live as a Jew. And so there might be more of a continuity. So the fact that we might also be losing some continuity from generation to generation as people become less religiously observant, if you will.
Yes.
That makes sense to me too. Now, do you have stats about intermarriage specifically?
Well, I do. The rates of intermarriage has risen dramatically over the last 50 years, according to this Pew research. That before 1970, 17% had a non-Jewish spouse. So this is a self-identifying Jewish person with a non-Jewish spouse.
Okay,
before 1970.
To flip that really quick, that'd be 83% of Jewish people were married to another Jewish person.
Yes.
Okay.
And then if you take that to 2000 or later, it goes to 58%, which means 42%. It's like cut in half.
Right.
It's cut in half.
Yeah, maybe not quite half, but
not quite
it's a
half.
dramatic drop.
Right.
And that's in 25 years?
That's
or 30
that's
years.
From, so that would be in only 30 years,
in
yes.
2 generations, sort of, as they sort of calculate the generations.
Well, just a generation and a half even. Isn't a generation usually 20 years?
Yeah, so a generation
roughly,
and a half.
Yeah. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then when they're talking about this, they actually broke it down by the generations. Let's see. So it would have been 92% having 2 Jewish parents in the silent generation.
Okay.
And then going to the boomers, 77% have 2 Jewish parents.
Okay.
And
that's
to
actually
Gen
a fairly
X,
significant drop.
That's a
over
drop
10
right there.
percentage points right there. That's pretty impressive. Goodness.
Right. That was a huge drop. And I'm assuming the war had a lot to do with that too. I mean, you change so dramatically when there's this kind of outside pressure and danger, especially, to the Jewish people during that time. And then Generation X, it's 73%, not as huge a drop. And then the millennials, 48%. So almost, it's like from 92 to 48, they have 2 Jewish parents.
Wow.
And another bit of research I saw that I thought was interesting is that persons who are married to a non-Jewish, people who come from, Jews who come from a family with only one Jewish parent, they in turn tend to marry somebody who only has one Jewish parent. So
or to marry a person who's not Jewish at all.
Or not Jewish at all. Yes.
No, I'm wondering, what was the statistic? Was it that they marry a non-Jewish person? They themselves become intermarried if they are from an intermarriage?
Well, if they have one Jewish parent,
we would consider them Jewish, but not necessarily all of Judaism would.
Right. But if you also married somebody who has one Jewish parent. Right.
And is that what that statistic
That's kind of what it's saying. It's saying that if you you tend to not marry somebody who has 2 Jewish parents. You might marry a total Gentile, but you're not marrying somebody that has 2 Jewish parents. That's not happening. And there was what was this one? This one was Well, I think this was a survey that was done from 2011 through 2020, so about what 10 years, and about in the Jewish Americans in 2020 is what it was entitled, with the Pew Research, and it says that about 42% or 4 in 10 Jews have a non-Jewish spouse, and the recent marriages of intermarriage was more common. So in 2010, 61% of intermarriage themselves then had a non-Jewish spouse, but before 1980, only 18% of them had a non-Jewish spouse.
Right.
So that was a huge jump from 82% say they have one Jewish parent, 34% say they have two Jewish parents in the intermarriages. But I mean, there is that tendency for it to keep. I don't know. I hate to use the word watering down, but you know what I'm saying. It keeps diminishing. It's like, and I think that gets back to how is it practiced in the home?
Right.
What is done in the home? What is the consistency in the home of knowledge of who you are as a Jewish people, and what are the Jewish practices? What, everybody has to wrestle with the things that God says about, and people can say, hey, I'm kosher, I eat kosher, but an Orthodox Jew would laugh at what somebody else might think is kosher, but vice versa. I mean, but it's so personal. But yet everybody who is identifying as Jewish usually has something that they do that is related to being kosher in terms of their eating. But at any rate, I mean, I just feel this diminishing that keeps happening because it's not probably it's not happening in the home. If there are people who go out and they maybe, as you were saying, at Rosh Hashanah, they have one Seder, a nice one Seder together.
You mean
but
Passover,
do they do it?
not Rosh Hashanah.
Pardon me, not Rosh Hashanah. I'm so sorry, for Pesach.
Yeah.
But so they only have one Seder,
Right? And
so that's and they maybe do go to Yom Kippur service, maybe just to the Kol Nidre, but that means something. The kids are learning from that. The kids are getting something from that.
Yeah.
So
an interesting thing to me is maybe an issue specifically for Messianic Judaism. We have, I think, when we look at who should our children marry.
Okay.
And I can obviously speak to this because I have 5 children. My oldest is 18. And I think about this as my children are getting out there and meeting people.
Yes.
I have often said to my kids that though I would want for them to marry a Jewish person, it's more important to me for them to find somebody who loves Yeshua. And so that also is maybe like maybe to use your term,
yes,
a watering down in some ways, or like a reevaluating of what the most important thing is, right? At the end of the day, if it really comes down to a choice between like a person who really loves Yeshua but is not Jewish, maybe at least they're like open to it and open to raising the kids that come to be Jewish, versus finding a Jewish person, that's the most important thing, and maybe that Jewish person is kind of a mess spiritually and in a dark place. My desire as a dad would be to have somebody that has a relationship with Yeshua and that is filled with the Ruach and is living a life that's surrendered to God in such a way that there's like real transformation in their life that I think will spill out into my kid and into their my grandchildren and their, I think it's then hard for us as we're like looking at especially transmission of Jewish identity within Messianic Judaism. I think it's hard for us because I would say that many of the kids, my generation that grew up as like second generation Messianic Jews, there wasn't always a focus by those parents of, I would like for you to marry a Jewish person. There was more of like a focus, I would say, instead on like, find somebody that, loves God and loves you.
And loves the Jewish people.
Yeah.
Certainly, you don't want somebody that doesn't love the Jewish people.
But I'm talking about just the conversations I've had with people my age.
Right.
And I'm not sure that that was the conversation. For some of them,
I
it
think
was.
not.
For some of them,
Yeah.
the conversation was, man, transmitting on Jewish identity is important. There's a calling there. But for some of them, it was not. And I do believe that if you actually look at my generation, I'm really curious about the statistics. The
I'd love to know
UMGC
that.
actually commissioned a study on Messianic Judaism a few years ago, and we should try to get a hold of some of those stats. But
I think we still have those stats. I'll look for them.
yeah, if you can find those, that would be great for us to
Yeah.
maybe bring in our next podcast. But
Right.
there is for sure a greater rate of intermarriage among the second generation
That's
of
right.
Messianic Jews, and there was already a high number of the pioneer generation of Messianic Judaism in the 60s and 70s. There was already a high rate of intermarriage within those power couples that started Messianic synagogues
That's right.
and congregations.
That's exactly
And so,
right.
yes, some of them did make Aliyah, and I think that helped actually solidify Jewish identity within their families and change really kind of the destiny of even the conversation of, are we Jews, right, for their children and for their children's children. But for those who remained in the United States and were already intermarried couples, and I mean, you actually, in your own personal journey, we did talk about this in other podcasts people
Right.
should listen to, but you were willing and at some point led by God to really come into, even though I am these other ethnicities, it is important that we raise Jewish children. I do believe in this calling. I'm going to do this. I don't know that happened for like all of that pioneering generation of Messianic Judaism. For quite a few of them, yes. But I imagine that there was still some reticence among especially non-Jewish spouses of, how much of Messianic Judaism is really like a calling and necessary and I have to do.
It's interesting you say that because I'm thinking of several couples that I know that's what happened, that they did not, let's take it back to what you said, though, to the bottom line. The bottom line of the whole thing, the bottom line to life is Messiah.
Right.
The bottom line is Messiah. So the most important thing we can get out of this, we know that for Jew and Gentile alike, the bottom line is Messiah has come.
Right.
So when you say you want your children to marry somebody who loves Messiah, I'm 100% behind you. But I want it to be somebody who is at least open to that experience of what those kids are going to have to know, because we also know that at the end times, there's got to be an identifiably Jewish people. But I think some of this gets into, I think that generation, we were just so excited to find Messiah. I mean, I having come up as a Christian and believed in Jesus and fallen away, but your dad, who had never considered that Jesus might be the Messiah, for him, it was such a revelation. For most of them, it was such a revelation. It was like, from the beginning, they just thought they were even supposed to stop being Jews. Right. Oh, we're Christians now. Oh, right. We love Messiah, so we have to be called Christians. And then there was that revelation they all had was, hey, Jesus didn't stop being a Jew. You don't have to stop being a Jew because you believe in Jesus. In fact, your dad had always said it made him a better Jewish person, knowing Messiah and believing in Messiah. So I think, it's which generation emphasizes what. So in the beginning, we were just excited, we've come to Messiah. And then when all of the ones who were Jewish were saying, now can't we still worship in a synagogue? And then, of course, you're neither fish nor fowl. The church doesn't know what to do with you. The traditional synagogue doesn't know what to do with you. And so that's how Messianic Judaism was born. Right. And I think it's kind of a swing. It's not even a pendulum, but it's starting to swing back to where those of us who have come through that in your generation are starting to say, yes, Messiah is the most important thing. If you marry somebody who loves God and believe in Jesus, that he's their Messiah, the Messiah of the world, yay, that's it. Because that's salvation. That's the whole thing. But at the same time, we have a higher calling than that. We have a higher calling. The Jewish people have a higher calling to make sure they maintain their identity. And I think, one of the things that happens is we don't have places for kids to go to meet Jewish believers. The camps that we've been having the kids go to now that have been put on by various organizations and even our own union are amazing places. And we've seen wonderful marriages come out
Yes.
of kids meeting other Messianic Jews. But I think there is now more of an emphasis maybe with this generation. Now let's get back to, let's remind ourselves who we are. We have a journey, we have a calling within this belief in Messiah.
Yeah, I really want to interview Rabbi Glebe, because
Oh,
I think
do
Rabbi
too.
Glebe would
I do
say
too.
both.
Are you talking about Senior Glebe or
Senior
Junior?
Glebe, probably
Okay.
both. But
Yeah.
I think Senior Glebe would say you can have both.
Absolutely.
You can raise a Jewish kid,
Yes.
and you can tell them, look for a Jewish spouse who loves Yeshua. And
That's right.
they're out there. They're not mystical unicorns. They do
That's right.
exist. My own children met some other kids when they were out at this teen camp, which was a really wonderful one.
Yes.
And it was really interesting. My daughter came back, and she was talking about how it was so much fun and we met so many people. And then at some point she kind of let slip. At one point, all of the girls sat down together.
Uh-oh.
And even though they're not allowed to enter into romantic relationships during camp, they made a very detailed plan of who was going to marry who. So that they could all, continue the tribe, and they could all marry other Jewish kids and have Jewish kids and let their Jewish kids
Of
play
those
together.
attendees.
So they matched up all of
the girls
attendees.
were doing this,
the
though.
girls
The boys
were matchmaking, and the boys were out, I don't know, playing in the canoes. So it's interesting to me, though,
But
because
that's wonderful.
Right. And I think
love
that
it.
the more that we actually lean into those and realize
Yes.
the importance of those, it's the same thing as when I have premarital counseling with an intermarried couple, I'm going to intentionally bring up Jewish identity. I'm not necessarily going to go into all of the other parts of their cultural identities. I'm going to bring up that one because it has a calling, it has a purpose, there's an anointing on it. They need to actually wrestle with it, and they need to figure out and answer those questions before the kids come, so that
Yes.
they actually know what they're going to live out in their lives. And if we can actually then shift that even a little bit younger and say, can we get them to meet other Jewish people who love Yeshua and
Yes.
maybe fall in love with those people? And man, I don't know, this is going to sound weird because I was so far from it in my own life, but a little bit of matchmaking is not necessarily a bad thing. Although there were some matchmakers on the back end.
You were a victim, or you were
a beneficiary of matchmaking.
Of a little bit of matchmaking.
Right.
And
there were people that knew that Rosemary came from a Jewish family, knew that I came from a Jewish family, and they're like, oh, hey, you guys would be a good fit. And so they kind of worked, which was helpful because I was pretty shy and I wasn't going to go out and ask a girl out or anything like
That's
that.
right.
And so it was really helpful that they kind of maneuvered us into getting to know one another. So there's much to be said about that. It's interesting.
Yeah.
You were talking, I think we're going to deal with this when we talk about kosher or treif at the end. But you've watched some of these Jewish matchmaking shows. I've watched some of them too. I think they're really amazing. I don't know if you've watched the ones on Netflix or where, but the one on Netflix is the
On
one
Netflix.
I watched. Yeah, with this
I
lady.
love the matchmaker. She's amazing. I love her.
Yeah, she's great. She's really, really
She doesn't
smart.
deal with, she takes everyone at, as who they are. Whatever their level of observance is, she tries to match them with somebody that is also Jewish, but has that same level.
Right.
And I don't know. She just has a
It
sweetheart.
was actually okay, I'm going to go down this rabbit trail really quick.
Uh-oh.
One of the episodes, I don't know if you remember this, but it was two young people from the Orthodox community. And they were actually both pretty observant.
Yes.
And he was kind of well-to-do, like a banker or a lawyer or something. And she came from kind of a well-to-do family. And they got together and they totally clicked. And they had such chemistry and such connection. But he didn't daven. He didn't go to as many of the corporate prayers at the synagogue as her father and her
3
brother.
a day.
Right.
3 a day. Yeah.
He did not go for
Right.
Shachrit and Ma'ariv. He didn't go for all of them. And so she was like, I'm sorry, you're not a fit. And she just
I know.
walked away. And I was like, wow. And
I
so
know.
it's interesting to me. I get it.
What character, though, just to put God first, because to her, that's the quintessential thing. And she loves God. She loves the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She does not yet know that Jesus is that Messiah coming.
Right.
But she is in that place where she really just wants to serve God with her whole life. And she knows she can't take on a partner and in fact, did you notice what she said? It wasn't just someone equal to her. She wanted a man to lead her in it.
Right.
She wanted
Maybe
him to even
more
be
observant.
stronger,
Right.
slightly more observant. Yeah, and then did you see when he went to talk to his rabbi?
Yeah.
And the rabbi, tried to talk it through with him. But I think the guy had to come to some kind of realization that this is who I am right now, and I need her to accept me who I am for who I am, rather than who she hopes for me to become. I think that's smart. That is
That's
smart.
true.
But I thought it was interesting that he didn't think that he couldn't kind of picture himself being that person.
Right.
But frankly, I'm glad I think they only had 2 dates to find that
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Well, isn't that great too? Like their dates were with a lot of intention. It wasn't like, oh, what's your
Yes.
favorite album? No,
Yeah.
it was like, how many times do you go to synagogue?
Yeah.
What is your minyan like? Like,
Yeah.
what is your home like?
Yeah.
How do you guys celebrate like kashrut? Like, what do
Do
you
you
do?
speak Hebrew?
Yeah.
Or are you Israeli even?
Right. Yeah. Like, and so there's those sorts of conversations.
I know.
So
Yeah.
to maybe put a little bit of like a bow on this, though it's really hard. I think you and I both agree that passing on, transmitting Jewish identity is really important.
Absolutely.
And it's certainly a hard task in this day and age for any of these intermarried families. I know that you have known some intermarried families, and do you feel that we do a disservice in some way to that next generation by not maybe pushing the intermarried families towards more of a wrestle? Like I can do some of it when I do premarital counseling, but like it's hard after they're married. It's hard to like go to
Right.
a family that's already established and say,
Right.
hey, your children don't really seem to be like getting a hold of what it means to be a Jew. Right. And do you feel that sometimes we're not like forceful enough? Because the Orthodox community has been able to maintain such standards for like having Jews marry Jews because it's important to them. And if you don't do it, you're stepping outside the fold, and it's not okay. And I don't want to be like super legalistic or hard on people, but like I wonder if there's a place within Messianic Judaism for a little bit more of a push of door to door, and like, man, this is so important. And I know it's not just on us to make sure that the Jewish people are preserved and that there are believers in Yeshua among the Jewish people. That's a God task. That's a God-sized task. But do you feel that we don't advocate for it enough or push for a real intentionality with that next generation?
That's interesting because I've actually been thinking about that. How can we better serve, even in our own congregation, the mixed marriages that are there? Because we're seeing the same kind of statistics there. We're seeing, that the Jewish one wants to be there, is usually engaged, very engaged. The non-Jewish one, it may even attend, but may not be very engaged. And as we've seen in our congregation, that's predominantly where the man is the non-Jewish one.
Right.
And I do think it's difficult for a man who has I'm sure men know it. You must know, that you're responsible for your family. You have a spiritual responsibility before God for your family. And men feel that, and they need to be 100% in.
Right.
It's one thing for a woman like me to come in and realize that that's important because your dad was providing that foundation and pushing forward. But I've wondered what we can do. And this gets on a touchy subject for me, and we might disagree. So prepare yourself.
Right. Let's do it.
I think
Gloves
there's something, I think there's something we've got to do with the Jewish families that we have, the mixed marriage families that we have. I appreciate the things you are doing, the way you work with them, etc. But the message that we're sending to the non-Jewish one is still communicating to them that they are other. Now, they're not Jews, but they're not exactly other. And, how do we reconcile the fact that they're in Echad? And if they are fully coming in and wanting to be part of everything that's going on, and for the sake of their children, they want the culture, they want the rituals, they want the liturgy, etc. I'm just asking, is there another category? I mean, when I'm doing the statistics and looking at the database in our congregation, I tend to call people Jewish or mixed marriage or non-Jewish. So I think a mixed marriage spouse that is not the Jewish one is in a different category. And I don't know what that would look like, but I think there's got to be some way that we can encourage them to want to pass on and to especially the men, because as we say, it's primarily men. How do we engage them in such a way that they still feel that there's a spiritual head of their home? So, I mean, I wrestle with this one because I don't know the answer. I'm putting it out
I'm
there.
not sure
They're not called up to aliyah. They're not, they're not wearing a tallis.
Right.
And I'm not promoting that. I'm just saying, what is it that we can do that sets them apart the way I believe God sets them apart? I think they're a step above righteous Gentile for sure, because they have taken on a Ruth calling. For the ones that let me just say, some have, but I think some would if they knew how to do it, if they knew. And I don't know
and part
how
of the
we can help
problem
them.
is that you almost need a strong example of that to lead them. I have a
That's
different
true.
voice. When I have a conversation with them, I'm a Jewish person married to a Jewish person.
Right.
And so
exactly.
fundamentally, I don't understand, right? Like I don't get where they're at, because though I have good intentions, like I'm not living in the midst of that marriage, and like I haven't really experienced that sort of pressure in my life, and that's right. So it is hard in a term of practical ministry, and I think that there's two things that have to be dealt with. One is people have to actually be able to get really secure in their own value as simply a child of God. That is,
of course.
but like we say that, of course, but
I know.
people don't.
Yeah.
People don't have their value in that. Nobody does. Like I don't even most of the time. Most of the time I have my value in what I do and what I accomplish and how I serve my family.
That's true.
Rather than the fact that like just God loves me. Like, getting back to what you said at the very beginning.
Magic mirror, right.
Like being able to look, because when I understand how much God loves me, then my own ethnicity and culture doesn't matter. Like, what does he want my kids to be? Then I'll just do whatever he wants. Like, I don't care. And so I think that in order to get to that place, there has to be a real spiritual, like, discipling that gets people to that level. But it's also a hard discipling for a person in my condition, as it were, as a Jew married to a Jew, to do, because I haven't had to wrestle through it in the same way. Right? Like, I haven't had to be the Gentile within a relationship and surrender my own desires and druthers to whatever God wants. You have. You've had to do that.
But I'm a woman. I don't. But you understand.
But you're a woman, and so you see where we're at. We're at a crossroads here, like within our own community. Now, other Messianic communities may have these people that can speak into those relationships, but it is difficult to speak into that relationship when you're not coming from that equal footing. So maybe what we need to do is ask God to provide that, to provide a strong Gentile man who's married to a strong Jewish woman, and they're raising Jewish kids, and like he's figured out how to be surrendered in that place. And I mean, there are other potential solutions too, and we'll go into this as we continue our conversation into conversion. One of the solutions to this problem as it were, is for the non-Jewish person to convert. And so there to be a unity there of Jewish identity among the parents, and so then like it can be passed on. That's a whole separate conversation, but that is one solution that people have proposed, right?
Well, fortunately, I mean, for sure, within traditional Judaism, that's what they propose.
Yes,
and in every denomination, they propose it. They push it. Some stronger than others, but they push it.
You have a conversation with a rabbi. We want to get married. Yeah. Cool. When will you convert? Yeah,
but in reality, for who we are as Messianic Jews, I don't think the whole point is. We are already, once we believe in Jesus, whether we even know he's the Jewish Messiah, but when we believe in him, we're already in the Commonwealth. We're there. Right. We're not Jews, but we're there. So there is no need for conversion. There is no need for a believer in Jesus to convert to become a Jew. Right. But I struggle with that one only because there are certain circumstances where in terms of what the society is going to recognize in terms of, as we know, even like burial rights, et cetera, with your father, those kinds of issues came up. But for most people, I don't think it should be it's somewhere else. I don't think that's it, but we'll get into that when we get into conversion. Right. But I feel like it's more about what can we do to help them realize just how special their calling is to even be the spiritual head of a household that is raising Jewish children with that identity and everything else you have. We have some amazing ethnicities in our family, and I
But
love them all. But,
they
but
have to
I still
show
feel like
up.
it's on
They have to
us.
show up for us to even have that conversation with them.
That's true.
And
Absolutely.
they don't show up because they feel at odds, or they feel uneasy, or
I think it's
a
awkward. I think
Messianic
it's
congregation doesn't
awkward.
feel like
Yeah.
home. And so you really have to have, I think, like more of personal interaction and an ability to really get deep into those conversations. And that's hard too. I mean, do you know how deep of a relationship you have to have with another man before you can talk about being spiritual head of the home?
Oh, no, I'm not.
Dude,
It's
as a
probably
man,
hard.
like,
Yeah.
it does not come up. I have had really, really deep friends. I think the only people that I've ever been able to actually have spiritual
That's interesting.
conversations on that level with are elders in our community, because we're expected to speak about spiritual things. We're here as elders, and so we're going to talk about spiritual things, so they can have a conversation with me about, like, hey, are you all right as the head of your home? Are you able to bear up under what you're doing right now? Let me pray for you and let me support you. But like, those conversations do not happen with men unless you know them for a long time, unless
Okay.
there is like a real investment. And
Yeah.
so there is also, I think, an impetus that needs to happen on the part of the Jewish person within those marriages of, if that really is important to you, and maybe even hopefully before the marriage you can do the premarital counseling, but like, if that's really
Yes,
important to you, it really matters where you go to worship.
it
Like, if you
does.
show up over and over on Shabbat, then there might be some curiosity, then there can be a deeper conversation, there can be relationship that's built over
Yes.
time. But people want the result without putting in work, and this is work. This is not like, there's no magic video that we could record where then
Hmm.
all the Gentile spouses are going to be like, oh man, I need to raise Jewish kids. It's like, it's best done in deep relationship. The only other time I've been able to have those conversations were with people that I was premarital counseling, and that's because they've given me permission to be in the
Yes.
most, like, intimate conversations
Hmm.
of their life. And it's so hard from a perspective of like, there's no getting together with people. Like, I have family members that I see, like, once a month, and like, we don't talk about spiritual things,
And
even
you
though we
live
see
three
each
miles
other.
apart.
Yeah, even though we live
Not
so
even
close to each
a
other,
mile.
and even though we see each other like once a month, and most
Yeah,
families don't even do that, but we still don't have those types of
that's
conversations,
true.
right? And so there has to be a like a real and see, man, this, oh man, don't get me started. This goes into my whole idea of like, what is Messianic Judaism if all we're doing is spending 99% of our time ministering to Hebraicized Gentiles who show up in our communities, man? Because then we're not actually living out what our calling is, to have those sorts of conversations that you're
Right,
talking about,
right.
which require massive amounts of human
Yes,
capital investment and time.
yes.
And if we're always distracted by somebody coming in because they want to wear a talit, or they want to like celebrate Passover, and they want to know what shoes they should wear on Yom Kippur, it's like, stop. Like, I need to actually be able to go have a conversation with this family over here. And often we don't, and we can't build a relationship
I
with
know.
them because all the others' wheels are squeaky. And so then they end up leaving because they don't have those conversations. They don't feel supported. They
Hmm.
don't know what to do. They don't know how to worship. They don't know what their holocaust should be in their house. So, oh man, sorry.
Well,
Yeah, that was
they
my
feel
rant.
like Messianic Jews do in general in terms of the church and traditional synagogues. Neither fish nor fowl.
Right.
I think it's an identity issue that I think you're onto something though. It needs to be nurtured. I mean, the guys need to go out and have a beer together. I
Yeah.
mean, whatever happened to just the guys having that time
Dude,
together? You
whatever
know?
happened to free time? I mean,
Oh,
honestly,
I
if you want to
know.
talk
Oh,
about
I know. Let's
spiritual
don't even go
warfare,
there.
if you
Oh,
want to
yeah.
talk about spiritual warfare, there is no beer time. There is no time.
Yeah.
Like, if you are a family and you have a couple of kids, you don't have a life. You don't talk to other adults. Maybe you doom scroll TikTok or Instagram
Well,
sometimes to
wow.
connect with the rest of the world,
I
but like,
know.
it is very rare and it is very real that there is an absolute war against people
That's
being
true.
able to deeply connect with one another. It's
But I do think, Josh, I think it's been good getting the men's group going again. And I've
yeah,
also noticed that, once a month we have a women's group and after service, and once a month we have a men's group, a different Shabbat. But I've noticed that when the women were in the meeting, the men are all out there hanging out and they're talking about some good stuff.
yeah,
And vice versa. The women are hanging out together when the men are in their meeting. So I think that's kind of the beginnings of something. But it needs to be nurtured. It needs to be very intentional.
yeah.
Pretty much like you've tried to do once a month with the Intermarriage.
Right.
That I think if you can be that intentional about the fullness of what we're going to do to help bring these people on board, because they've got to know they're not losing anything. It's like somebody saying, "Oh, I'm losing my daughter. She's getting married." No, you're gaining a son.
Right.
It's that mentality that says I must be losing something to be gaining this. No, you're gaining. It's all gain. It's all gain.
That's a great place to wrap this one up for today. We actually need to be pretty quick, I think, about our kosher or treif, because we're
okay.
over an hour. We're setting
gosh.
new records for our podcast.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, my.
No, it's not
sorry.
your fault. No, it's not your fault. I'm a yapper. It's what I do. But, okay, hit me with your kosher or treif question, because I thought it was great.
Well, this kind of came out of part of watching the Jewish Matchmaker, and I know people in this category, not necessarily Messianic Jews, just Jews in general, that are very precise and careful and intentional about remaining kosher at home. I mean, even some of them all the way into being Orthodox and the separations, the refrigerators, the whole thing. And then they will go out to eat and choose to eat non-kosher.
Right.
To me, I don't know. It's like, what?
So the question
like
today
God
for
isn't
kosher or
watching
treif
Yeah.
is literally kosher or treif.
Is it kosher? Are you eating kosher or
is
are
it
you
kosher
eating
to
treif?
eat treif?
Or is it
Right.
kosher / treif? What is it?
Okay, so
I mean, I can
what are your
respect
thoughts?
it, if whatever it is, if they do it consistently. To me, I'm saying that's treif.
Right. So for me, there's a passage in Romans that encourages us that we ought not to get super involved in what other people are eating or drinking,
Right.
or what festivals or holidays they celebrate. The only concern I would have about that is, are they being intentional? Are they really looking at kosher as an actual commandment from God?
Right. Right.
If this is something that God has given us that we are expected to continue to do, then should we not obey it? It's almost like saying, well, then should we choose whether or not we want to circumcise our sons based on what the world is telling us? Or if the lobster looks really good, the surf and turf on the menu looks really good, should I order it? To me, it goes back to an intentional life. If
Yes.
you actually believe what you're saying you believe, then you actually believe it.
It should show up in your whole life.
Right.
Regardless of what it is. I'm not promoting any of it.
It becomes your life.
Yeah.
And so it also comes back to me of I think we have to be careful about how much, and I'm okay with people keeping very halakhic, Orthodox kosher and separation of utensils and everything else. That's fine if they actually believe that the Spirit is guiding them to do that and there's a freedom and there's life in it. But if there's not, if there's any sort of part of this where it's I'm doing this because I'm better than Joe down the street, or if there's any sort of sense of
it would be
I
schmooly.
have to do this thing in order to be pleasing to my Heavenly Father, or He's going to be angry with me, or if there's any of these places where it's not just a pure, God told me to do this and I'm going to do it. For me, for example, we don't keep, separate utensils or separate refrigerators. We don't do that. And that, for me, is because I don't see that in the scriptures. And we could argue about that, of cooking the kid in its mother's milk and what that actually means. But I don't see it in the scriptures. And so for me to take that on would be false. And so it would be so easy for me to actually drop that when I left my house, if that's what I had taken on. And that's what I wonder about these people.
That's wonder.
Is it real? If it's real that you actually believe that God is asking you to do this and you actually are wanting to live to please Him, then like that girl you were talking about in the dating show, like if she actually really loves God and she believes that God wants her to have a husband that's even a little bit more observant than her to pull her into that, then she should live it. She should own it. And she did.
And she did.
She said, I'm sorry, you're not observant enough for me. I love you. You really click.
Seemed like
you're
a great
cool
guy.
But like, no, not for me. And that's how I feel about this too. So I feel like it's only kosher if the Spirit has set you free.
Be consistent. Yeah.
Right. And there's like life in
what's life?
What God
brings
is
life?
asking you to do.
Yes.
And there's death in what our own flesh takes on.
That's a good point.
All the time. And it's hard. So
yeah.
Okay, well that's a great conversation. Thank you, Mom. I really appreciate you. We'll
I appreciate
be back
you.
soon, I hope. Well, I think we can do one next week, right?
Okay.
Man,
sure.
What I really want to try to do is arrange for one of the Gleebies. I want one of the Gleebies to come in here and talk to us about how it's not either or. You can find a Jewish person who loves Yeshua and you can marry both of them. And
I think either of them would love to. Well, do you remember when the younger Glebe was getting married and the older one called you to talk about the prospect
that
he had chosen.
I'd love to like maybe invite them into the conversation. But either
that
way,
would be lovely.
We'll be back. And once again, if people want to find more of us, we're on bethyeshua.org. Or you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, a bunch of other places too. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye, Mom.
Bye. Always stimulating.
Yeah, this is good.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can always visit bethyeshua.org for more.